Hello and welcome to our live event, Scotland from the Sky. I'm Kirsty Millican. I'm the Aerial Survey Projects Manager at Historic Environment Scotland. And today I'll be talking to Jamie Crawford about the archives and technology behind the BBC television series Scotland from the Sky. So if you want to ask us a question as we're live, you can do this now on our Facebook page or on our YouTube channel if you're logged in with your Google account. And also the event will be recorded and available for you to watch at a later date at your leisure. So let's dive straight in and welcome our guest. Hello, Jamie.
Hello, hello.
Thanks very much for being part of this event. Jamie is the presenter of the BBC Scotland from the Sky series. Most of us will have seen the two series on the BBC. So just to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Jamie, and a little bit about Scotland from the Sky?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a writer and presenter now, but for 11 years I worked at Historic Environment Scotland, just like you do, Kirsty. And I worked predominantly with the archive, not as a curator of the archive, not as a creator of the material. I wasn't taking the photographs. I have a whole team of wonderful photographers who do that. But really, I was interpreting it and researching it, mostly in my role as publisher. And if you peel back the layers of what that means, it was trying to tell stories. It was trying to find ways of telling stories about an archive, and an archive, I think, at that time that possibly was not particularly well known in Scotland to a wider audience beyond professionals. So it was looking at ways to try and expand knowledge of it, interest in it, and engagement with it. And one of the things that caught my eye very early on was the aerial photography archive. And the nature of that archive, I mean, really, it wasn't one archive. It was lots of different, disparate archives, all from different sources. So that might have been RAF photography that was taken in the 1940s. It might have been aerial survey photography, which is what obviously you do now, which didn't start till I think it was 1977. That's right, isn't it?
76.
76, sorry, 76 when the aerial survey program started. And I think the thing that really changed the nature of that archive was at the time that I started, the Royal Commission, which has now become part of HES, had acquired the Aerofilms collection along with English Heritage down south and the equivalent body in Wales. And that, I think, was the key that sort of unlocked the door of using the aerial photography archive to tell this wide story of Scottish history, particularly 20th century Scottish history, but actually also to look at the archaeological story. And just to give a bit of background about Aerofilms, that was the world's first commercial aerial photography company. It started in 1919. It was, people who'd flown fighter planes and reconnaissance planes during the First World War. And when the war ended, they took decommissioned planes and cameras and started flying, basically taking photographs to sell to people, photographs of landmarks, of businesses. They didn't make their way, I think they started, the first photograph was in 1919 in London. They didn't make their way to Scotland until 1927. But even then, once they started photographing Scotland, from that moment in 1927 up to the present day, you almost had, not entirely unbroken, but an incredibly comprehensive record of Scotland, and at a time of remarkable change. So really, all of that material coming together at that time led to us producing a series of books using the archive, books like Above Scotland Cities, and those then led on to the sort of foundation for the television series, which draws on such a fantastic archive.
Brilliant. So, as you said, the series draws on the amazing aerial archive that we hold at Historic Environment Scotland. This is a living archive, so we're adding to it all the time. Jamie, in the series you go into details or some detail about some of the ways in which the aerial photography held in archives can show how Scotland's landscapes have changed over thousands of years. Can you talk us through how you used some of the imagery in the series to show that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess it was the starting point. The original kernel behind the whole series was that very simple concept of then and now. You know, if you've got a photograph of a place in 1927 and a photograph of a place in 2007, then you can probably make an interesting comparison. So that was our kind of thought process, that you can do that. Now, there's obviously, when you start to think logistically about how do you do that, that's when you have to get into the realms of, okay, it was a plane flying in 1927 at a certain altitude. What can we do today? Well, we can use a helicopter. We can then hover the helicopter almost exactly the same spot, or try and find exactly the same spot that the photograph was taken, if we can, if altitude allows, if circumstances allow. The helicopter that we use has a camera on the front of it, a film camera, which is actually more expensive than the helicopter itself, which kind of gives you a sense of how advanced that camera is. So that was the kind of starting point. Is what we'll do is we'll try and find ways of telling interesting stories about change in Scotland. But to do that, we need to go up in a helicopter. We need to try and find those photographs from the archive, look at the locations themselves just now, and then using both the footage that we create and the archive and graphical technology, we can interleave these and create a kind of moving, living then and now. And we've got an example, a clip we can play in just a second, which is taken from the second series, where we were looking at the history of industry, really, in Scotland, going actually for hundreds, certainly even thousands of years. We went to Loch Marie and looked at the beginnings of the sort of iron industry, or certainly the modern iron production industry, but then followed that through to the steel industry and the vast, very famous Ravenscraig steelworks, which was in Motherwell. And that leads us into this clip, which we can show now about how we used that archive.
Through the 80s and early 90s, images of the towers of Ravenscraig dominated the news. Politicians, strikes, and threats of closure. Today, only the footprints of those towers remain.
And there you are. You can see what we're trying to do there is create that then and now effect. And it's very powerful with Ravenscraig, because that was such a fixture in the landscape. And the site that's been left behind by the demolition of everything that's there is absolutely vast. I think it's considered the largest waste ground in Europe. It's about the size of 70 football pitches. So that's one aspect of how we tell the story. What then follows on from this clip, which we're not going to show you just now, is that we then land the helicopter in the footprint of one of those massive cooling towers, and we get out and we meet people down on the ground there who work there. And I mean, the thing about a site like that is a lot of people will look at it and think it's just horrifically ugly. You know, it's smoke, it's industry, but to the people who worked there and the community who lived around there, it was their lifeblood. It meant a lot to them. You know, it kept their sort of food on their table and, you know, their families in work for decades, and then suddenly it's gone, and it's still gone. You know, when we went there, it was bizarre. It's kind of been naturally seeded largely by birch trees, and it's like a vast country park with these long roads running through it, which used to connect all the different works buildings. But there were, you know, kind of deer running around in that space. So that's one way that we would try and use what was in the archive. That photograph, I think, is from the 1980s, and then bring that to life with the modern day story. And with that episode, which was looking at industry, we're really looking at how it was such a common thread in Scottish history that one or other industry would really rise to incredible prominence and dominate a landscape for a period of time, and then very quickly disappear again, and something else would take its place, not in the same space, somewhere else. And actually what you're left with are these traces, scars, bits of landscape that still speak to that older story.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful image, actually, and tells such an amazing story. But do you always use a helicopter for these images?
No, we don't. I mean, there's various reasons for that. Cost is one of them, because it's very expensive to go up in the helicopter. But also storytelling. You know, if the whole series was just me buzzing around in a helicopter, I think it would be lacking something. And I mean, some people maybe wish it was just lots of aerial footage looking down, but what we like to do is try and tell the human story as well. We kind of have that God's eye view, that perspective where we're looking down on a landscape, but then we can go and talk to people as well. So we use other aircraft. We use drones, which we'll come on to in a minute, but the other aircraft is interesting because in every series, and the third series, which is going to be coming out very soon, and we can maybe talk about that later, every series we've used this tiger moth, which belongs to a professor of geography at Edinburgh University called William McCannis, and it's a 1949 tiger moth. Beautiful, beautiful aircraft. And the reason we first used it is we were trying to tell a story of actually the origin of aerial archaeology. That's the aircraft there, beautiful aircraft. And that goes back to a man called OGS Crawford. That's Osbert Guy Stanhope Crawford, very catchy name. No relation, by the way, or not that I've managed to determine so far. But in the 1930s, he started flying around Scotland, trying to look down and find archaeology. And he thought this was incredibly effective. I mean, he, at the time, was saying things like the archaeologists of the future need to get in the sky. I'm sure you'd agree with that, Kirsty, that he was exactly right on that. So in the first series, we're kind of looking at his early flights around Scotland. And then this clip that's about to come up is from the second series. And we were looking for a Roman road, the first Roman road really that was built into Scotland. So we, myself and William, were in the tiger moth. And of course, to get this footage, there's a helicopter flying very close behind us. You won't be able to see that, but just think of that when you watch this clip.
Yeah. That's it below us. Yep. Dry stone wall just helps you see the route it takes through the countryside. Yes. Now we're going right down the road. What a stunning view of it. Yeah. That is Scotland's very first motorway. There's only really cows that are travelling on it these days. Yeah. This is one of the best sections. You can really see very clearly how that road must have looked.
The view from above reveals the sheer scale of the road and the ambitions of those early Roman builders. We can also see how the road has changed over the centuries.
That's it, now it becomes a modern road. Yeah, that's the transition. It's amazing to think the number of armies who've marched up and down this road. Wow.
So there you go. That was a lot of fun being in that.
That was a lot of fun, I think. Yeah.
That tiger moth and heading down this, this Roman road, which you can still see really clearly, and it's amazing that transition where it then basically becomes it's a sort of modern B road that it runs along, and so it's fun being up in the sky. You can kind of follow these things in a way that you can't so effectively follow them on the ground. So we've got the helicopter, we've got the tiger moth, which becomes a recurring feature. But actually, I think in many ways, the most important aspect of making the programs and the things that probably would make it hard to do the program otherwise is drone technology. Mm-hmm. And, in the course of, we were filming the new series over the summer, and one of the things we were talking about among the crew was that it's only really, really recently the drone technology has come into filmmaking. The first time it really started appearing in documentaries was about 2014. The first Scotland in the Sky was filmed in the summer of 2017. So that's only 3 years after they started using it. And of course, the drones themselves are changing. When the drones started, they were petrol. These kind of like mini helicopters, basically. They were quite expensive, they were quite unwieldy, they were incredibly dangerous, actually. So now they kind of run on sort of electric battery. But I think it's one thing having the technology, it's another thing understanding how to use the technology to tell stories. And obviously we can't be in a helicopter the whole time. We can't be in a tiger moth the whole time for all sorts of different reasons. So when you go to certain locations, particularly certain remote locations, you want the drone to be able to help you tell that story. It's closer, it's more intimate, its altitude cap is, around sort of 500 meters, I think. So it's never going to get that high, but it still allows you to show really interesting visuals and really bring the past to life. And we've got a perfect clip to illustrate that with a clearance village on the Isle of Mull in Chiaba. Sorry, a clearance village called Chiaba on the Isle of Mull, which was cleared in the 19th century. And with the drone, we can look at the traces of the landscape that are still there. Obviously, there are buildings still there. There are still ruins, but there's remains of farming there. You can still see cultivation ridges in a way that we couldn't capture that from the ground. So this clip that's about to come shows that very well.
The clearance of Chiaba was especially shocking because it had been such a successful and thriving township. From the air, you can grasp its original extent. More than 20 houses, a school building, a mill for grinding corn. Down by the sea, 2 fishermen's cottages, and a tiny chapel for the Sabbath. Chiaba is one of the most fertile parts of Mull, and ridges from ploughing and old field boundaries still stand out.
Yeah, the aerial views really shows that really clearly, doesn't it? So anybody watching, we're happy to answer questions. So if you want to pop a question in the chat or on Facebook, we'll try and pick them up. So please do ask questions if you've got any. Yeah, so that just really does show, Jamie, doesn't it, just how important the aerial view is to kind of see the kind of scale of these things. I suppose one of the other important ways in which the aerial archive that we maintain adds to our understanding in the way in which the landscape has changed is in how we can record archaeological sites and features that tell us how people have lived and worked and used the landscape for thousands of years. One really important and powerful way of doing that is through crop marks. We record crop marks during the summer months. So there's hopefully an image should come up quite shortly, which shows a crop mark site. Just to explain, crop marks are differences in height and colour of crops. They're formed by the differential growth of crops above buried archaeological sites and features. When we can record these colour differences from the air, the aerial view is really important for that. Crop marks tell us about archaeological sites and features buried beneath the plough soil, and these are sites we wouldn't know about otherwise, because in general the features above the ground have been levelled by the plough. And the image you can see here is a monument which you could call the Kirsty monument, which is dates in the Neolithic period, so about 5,000 years ago. It's just north of Dumfries by the village of Hollywood. And Kirsty monuments are these long enclosures which were originally defined by a bank and ditch. In the case of Hollywood here, the ditch is long gone, and we're just left with the outline of the bank is long gone, and we're left with the outline of the infill ditches to find this long enclosure. And we usually interpret these as ceremonial monuments. The Kirsty at Hollywood is one of about 60 or so that we know of in Scotland. And all but 3 of those have been recorded through crop mark archaeology. So it's really important, certainly for this type of monument, but for a lot of Scotland's archaeology or British archaeology across the world, actually crop marks are really important. So in Scotland, we've got about 9,000 sites, crop mark sites in our database. and they give us really important information about people's lives in the past. They vary from very modern features, so we've recorded things like World War II practice trench or World War I practice trenches, down to modern field boundaries that have been removed a few years ago, down to monuments like this Kirsty monument, which was built by some of the first farmers in Scotland, and everything in between. So there's a really, really important way of our method of recording the past use of the landscape and how people lived and worked and worshipped in the landscape over many thousands of years. But just sometimes...
Sorry, Kirsty, it was just
a
couple of years ago, people were getting very excited because it was such a dry summer. I think it's particularly down in England that crop marks were emerging in a way that they hadn't done for decades. How has that been in Scotland over the last few years?
So it was 2018 was that really amazing year, which was actually amazing. Well, it was amazing in Scotland as well. We got quite a number of sites that hadn't been seen for a long time, new sites appearing. And that was just a fantastic bonanza that really added to our understanding of the record, added new sites that we didn't know about. So a new Roman site, a Roman camp appeared down somewhere in the Borders. Can't remember exactly where at the moment, which we didn't know about. You know, we think we know about lots about the Romans, but there's still new sites to record that we wouldn't otherwise know about. But what's interesting is since that date, that's been an amazing year. The following year was the worst year of crop mark archaeology that we've ever had. It was just a terrible year. But I think that's the kind of pattern that we're seeing we'll come on to some of the kind of issues about climate change a little bit later, but we're seeing with the changing weather patterns with climate change, that's having an impact on what we're able to see as well, crop mark wise.
Is that extremes then, that you'll get very dry spells potentially, but also very wet spells, hence one of the best years followed by one of the worst years?
Yes. Yeah, very much so. It's highly variable. It's always been variable because it's so dependent. Crop marks are so dependent on the weather patterns because they're dependent on patterns of weather and they need the kind of drought or semi-drought conditions for these contrasts to show up. But they're.
Do you ever find yourself praying for drought? Are you?
It's an awful thing to say, but yes, we do. We do go, yeah. But it also means it's also dependent on being drought at the right time. So the right time in the crop growing cycle. So you can get, really dry period, perhaps right at the very start of the growing period, and then a really wet period, and then it wipes everything out. So you just, the farmers wouldn't like us so much, but we very much do hope for drought at the right period of time.
Well, we've got another wee clip, don't we, which again illustrates this point about crop marking. This is a photograph, I'm trying to remember the exact date, I think it might be 1983, of a field in Aberdeenshire, a place called Riney, and there's a Pictish stone, big carved Pictish stone sitting in this field. This photograph was taken. It was only recently that a researcher from Aberdeen University, Gordon Noble, was going back, looking in the archive, looking for crop marking, and he came across this picture, which is about to be overlaid on top of this image in this clip, which will play any second.
That's the power of the view from above. You start off following faint clues, only visible from the sky, and soon you're unravelling whole new histories.
It's remarkable that an aerial photograph has given us a connection to one of Scotland's most enigmatic peoples and shown us a glimpse into the way they lived 1,500 years ago.
And there we are. That's that image with these circles around it, around that stone circle, and that then, sorry, not stone circle, standing stone, and that then brings researchers, brings archaeologists to study that and make new discoveries. That was excavated. They found sort of, jugs of wine from the Byzantine Empire appearing there in this little place in Scotland. And that's down to the view from above. That's the reason why they were digging.
Yeah, and it's these almost innocuous looking marks in the crops that are actually these highly important places. So Rhynie is a really important high status site, which where it wasn't until the Aberdeen University excavations that we realised just how important this site was. You know, as you mentioned, the crop marks, the enclosures have been recorded since the 1980s, and then it was 2011. So, you know, decades later, we actually realised, or had the research took place that showed us just how important this site was. And it makes you think how many more sites of real importance are lurking in the archives that nobody's had the time or the money or to excavate, to investigate. I think there's huge potential in the sites that we already have recorded, as well as the potential in the sites that we know we still look for, new sites that are still haven't appeared yet.
Yeah, but that's the thing. There's two sides to it, isn't there? There's photographs that have already been taken. You know, like in this instance, I'm trying to remember when Gordon Noble at Aberdeen first, I think it was only 2015 maybe, that he was digging up the photograph before digging up the actual ground. So you've got photographs you've already taken in the archive. And then, of course, you're still taking photographs just now. It may be interesting to talk through how you're continuing to grow that archive right now. Yeah, so
we have a aerial survey programme at HES that continues every year, and we fly in every year. Over the whole of the year, we fly in a small four-seater Cessna, which is a small aircraft that you can see on the screen here. Some people ask why we don't use drones. Drones, we do. We do have a drone pilot, but drones are really good for targeted survey of one or two sites. So you've seen the video of Shieba on Mull. So you can see how it's really good for illustrating very targeted sites. But what the small aircraft does is it gives us the ability to fly over large areas of the country, and cover a large area of ground. And particularly when you're looking for crop mark sites, you want to cover a large area of ground. You don't necessarily know what's going to show at what time, so we can cover large areas of Scotland. And the method is very simple. We go up in an aircraft. When we see a site we want to photograph, the photographer sits at the front with a camera, and we see a photograph, get the pilot to circle the site, bank over to one side, and then the photographer opens up the window and takes photographs out the window. It's as simple as that.
I see there's someone asking a question about what camera I use. I mean, I didn't take the photographs when I worked at HES. I just worked with them and tried to tell their stories. But I do sometimes take photographs when I go up, and I just have a Nikon with various different lenses that I use. But I'm sure people will be interested to know what, that's Bob who's taking that photograph there. I'm sure people will be interested to know what camera he uses.
We use Nikon cameras as well, the high format, high resolution image cameras for our archive, and we've a variety of different cameras and lenses, depending on what we're doing. So Bob's taking photographs of Glasgow there. That's the Red Road Flats.
Red Road Flats, which are gone, which of course are gone now. That's a perfect example.
So they're gone now. So we can have really high resolution images with that kind of high strong zoom lens on for that kind of image.
Did we used to use Hasselblad cameras? I have in my mind, which for people who like cameras is kind of like a very important make of camera. But it's interesting if we've moved back to Nikon now.
Yeah, we've moved back to Nikon for us anyway. I think different people have different aerial photographers have different preferences. Much as
I've always liked my Nikon, so I'm a Nikon devotee. No SpawnCon here. I'm not sponsored by Nikon, but I just like it.
They are good. So we have some few more questions from Facebook. Ruth on Facebook asked, does year-to-year comparison help? If so, how far back do your comparative sources go? So, I mean, Jamie, you talked a little bit about the history of aerial surveys, or, as you said, our kind of sources go back can go back as far as the 1920s. In terms of the HES's aerial survey, it began in 1976, but we've access to images taken prior to that from the Second World War onwards, so crop mark images from the Second World War effectively onwards. And yes, year-to-year comparisons do help. It depends what you're photographing. So crop marks don't show every year, but different years can show you different bits of information when they are showing. Obviously, Jamie, you've talked a little bit about how we can see changes in the landscape, like, for example, in Ravenscraig. So comparing different eras. And certainly for us as in terms of our aerial survey programme, we definitely do try to take photographs of landscape as a whole. So where we know we've got change like the removal of things like Ravenscraig or other industry, we do our best, at least within the resources we've got, to kind of photograph those changes to build up an archive. So there's a comparative record. So you saw the image of Bob taking the photograph of the Red Road Flats. That was taken many years ago, before we knew that Red Road Flats were going to be levelled. But that now forms a really important part of our archive, a really important part of history, really, of Glasgow's history. So, yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Jamie.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that I always find about the archive is there were these surveys of all of Scotland, which were done with vertical aerial photography, i.e. rather than the camera poking outside of a window, a camera poking directly down at an aircraft. And at the end of actually even before the end of the Second World War, they started flying these flights across Scotland to try and photograph pretty much every inch of the landscape. And then, you kind of create almost a mosaic of imagery of the landscape. And then that was done again right at the end of the 1980s, 1988, 1989. So you've got those two All Scotland surveys give a really interesting comparison over 40 years. I think what's changed now is they've become redundant because of satellite imagery. But actually, anytime you go on Google Earth, what you find is a patchwork of different satellite images, which keep being updated, but you don't necessarily have the year anymore, or a record of the year that you can go to, which almost feels like, for a researcher or for someone who's trying to understand landscape change, that it would be nice to have that data complete for a single year to understand how, say, from 1988, 89 to 2020, what are the leaps that we've made in landscape change over those 40 years. So there's almost, with the progress of technology, sometimes you can lose things.
You can. I think that's the unfortunate thing. We've got another question that says, Kunal on Facebook asks, archivally speaking, when was the first aerial photo of Scotland taken? My understanding is probably 1920s. I haven't looked into the exact date.
You might know better than me. There are aerial photographs that were taken from airships in I think during the First World War. And as far as I know, they're the earliest aerial photographs, unless anyone was taking a photograph from a tethered balloon. And obviously, the first ever photographs from the air were taken from tethered balloons, because that technology pre-existed photography. But as far as I know, it's these airship photographs, which I think the National Museum of Scotland holds. So they aren't in the HES archive. So just that would help make it even more complete if they did become part of the archive, which I think they should. Yeah. But these images, these aren't just pretty pictures. We've talked a little bit about what they tell us, but they can also tell us about really important issues like climate change. So we've got a clip here from the series about Fort George, which will just introduce this kind of subject a little bit more. So the clip will appear in a couple of seconds.
And the evidence is more than just anecdotal. In 1941, an RAF officer took this aerial photograph, showing the land below the northern wall. Today, seen from a drone, the retreat of this coastline is clear.
Coastal erosion and sea level rise are very much natural processes. They have always happened and they will always happen. But what makes it different now and what makes it different with climate change is the rate at which this change is happening. So in the past 20 years or so, sea levels in Scotland have been rising by about 3 millimetres a year. That's higher than the UK average, which is around about 1.4 millimetres a year for the 20th century. So what that shows us is that in the past 20 years, the rates of sea level have gone up, that it's getting faster.
It's a lovely little sequence that, I mean, it may seem to people a small thing, you know, that we've lost meters of coastline, but you know, as David Harkin, I was interviewing there, you know, explains, with excessive winter storms, now you might lose a meter a season, and obviously, what are the implications of that? Maybe the implications tomorrow aren't massive, but they might be in 10 years. They definitely will be in 20 years, and they certainly will be in 50 years. And any organisation like HES, which has the care of historic buildings as part of its remit, can't just think, well, 10 years were all right. They've got to future-proof. So knowing that this change is happening is incredibly important. You know, knowledge is the first step towards some form of prevention. But, you know, as I'm sure you will know, Kirsty, and I'm sure you can maybe show us with some images, sometimes there might not be anything you can do because sea level rise is inevitable.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, I think we've got a couple of images to show you, which just illustrates something of that, and it's actually something of the power of the aerial view to kind of tell us a little bit of something about that. So the first image is of the site of Dunanrua, a broch on the island of Pabby in the Western Isles. So broch is an Iron Age tower, and this might just look like a rocky headland, but you can see there's a little bit of green on there, and if you're able to look very closely, there's just a little bit of a structure on that. That little bit of the structure is all that remains of this large, which would have been a very large tower dating to the Iron Age period. And that little bit of green is all that's left of the vegetation that used to cover the whole of that headland. Now that headland has been, the vegetation, the kind of earth and ground cover has been removed through wave action over quite a long period of time, but that wave action, as well as removing the earth, has removed this very substantial structure, or what was a very substantial structure. So that tells you something about the power of the waves, but it also shows you the kind of the effect of the waves, and that's partly due to increased storminess, partly due to climate change, but also partly to do with rising sea levels. So that just, if you know a little bit about it, that just illustrates something of the power of the climate change, of the kind of coastal erosion and wave action on a site that was really quite substantial. The next image illustrates something similar as well. This is a site of the Links of Notland. That's Sheba. So there's another image coming up quite shortly of the Links of Notland on Westray in Orkney. So this is a site that's in the care of Historic Environment Scotland, but you can see that there's sand dunes and areas where the sand dunes have been scoured or are clear of vegetation. Now, this is a site of a Neolithic and Bronze Age and Early Iron Age settlement. Now, it had been covered in sand dunes and was quite stable with vegetation, but worsening erosion and the collapse of the dune system exposed this site, so that you can see the remains of, you can see it's kind of circle shapes and square shapes. These are the remains of these settlement, a kind of multi-period settlement. But the collapse of the dune system, what that happened meant was that the archaeology was at risk. So in the past, you would have blowouts, so you would have winter storms that would remove some of the sand, the dunes, and then scour some of the sand away. But what would usually happen was it would recover, it would infill again, the vegetation would recover. But what's happened over the last decade or so is that hasn't recovered. And it's exposed the archaeological remains beneath it. And this site has been the subject of quite a long-scale, long-term rescue excavation. So there are attempts to try and stabilise it, to try and protect the archaeological remains. It's a really difficult thing to do. And this is happening across the whole of that coastline. So there are archaeological remains that we know of that it's just not possible to protect all of it.
But I mean, realistically, a lot of these sites, and potentially Links of Notland, long term can't be saved.
Yeah, no,
that's something we have to. It is rescue archaeology, which means taking what we can from there to preserve it. But in situ, over time it's going to have to disappear.
It is, unfortunately. There just isn't the resources to protect everything, and it's just not possible to protect everything. So part of that, rescue archaeology is also just making a record of the archaeology, the features that we're losing. And there's some organisations who are doing that. So HES has a part in that, but there's a really great little organisation called SCAPE, which I forget what it stands for now. But part of what they do is they encourage the recording, they document and record heritage sites that are at risk on the coast. It's based at St Andrews University. And it's like a really important, really great citizen science element. So, individuals can themselves who know their coastline can get involved and record the sites before they're gone. But that's kind of really one of those really kind of sad effects of climate change that we're aware of, and actually something that we need to think really quite carefully about in terms of how we protect and record our heritage around the coastline.
I see there's a question from Kunal on Facebook asking why I keep saying AGS. It's HES I keep saying, which is Historic Environment Scotland, which is the thing up there, just up above my head. Sorry, Kunal, for using the acronym.
Yes. So what about, I can see some questions coming in about artificial intelligence and LiDAR data, and so we'll come on to that shortly. So we'll hopefully answer your questions. As I think there's one from Mike about artificial intelligence, and another from Colin about LiDAR. We'll come on to those, and hopefully we may answer your questions. We'll pick up on that as we go along.
Actually, there's an interesting one there from Colin about has aerial imagery solved any questions over sites intentionally flooded by reservoirs? It's been interesting. I've just noticed this over the last few weeks. For whatever reason, a lot of the reservoirs in Scotland, the water levels are quite low. I don't know if that was to do with rainfall. It was something we looked at actually in the very first series of Scotland from the Sky. We looked at the old road that went from Edinburgh to Skye, which was flooded. The current road which runs to Skye had to be moved further up the hillside, and the old road most of the time is underwater, but also there are houses underwater. And recently, I think for the first time in decades, a farmhouse at Upper Glendevon Reservoir, which is very close to where I grew up, just near Auchterarder, has appeared. And, that may have been underwater for a very long time. And I guess it's, people associate Scotland with lochs, and so many of the lochs that we have are man-made. They're connected to either water supply or hydroelectric power. And there's a very positive story of progress there about, particularly the hydro story, provided electricity to the Highlands in a way that it never had before and helped to modernise the Highlands. But there is a counter to that, which some communities suffered. Some communities were flooded and were lost. And I think there's something particularly poignant for people when things like chimney stacks start to emerge out of the water. This idea that I don't think many of these stories are secret stories. They're sometimes forgotten stories, though, because you don't necessarily pay much attention to the dam head. You just see the beautiful stretch of water of what actually used to be a river and which has become a dam. And actually, in the Aerial Archive, it's one of the things that, particularly the Aerofilms company that I mentioned at the start, they took a lot of photographs of dam construction in the 1940s and 1950s, which we can now compare with our own aerial photography, completed reservoir, dam, loch. And it's interesting to see, you can see that transformation in an instant snapshot of then and now. And sometimes there are buildings, of course, that are disappearing. And there were a lot of trees that had to be chopped down because it was going to look ridiculous to have treetops appearing above the top of the water level. So you get all these kind of denuded stumps when the water level gets low that appear along the loch side. So I don't know if there's necessarily any questions that are being solved by it, but aerial photography is really useful in again understanding. I mean, that when you're talking about damming a river, that's large scale landscape change, and that's going to leave an impact forever, for as long as the dam is there. And it's happened in a lot of places over Scotland. It has transformed a lot of Scotland's landscapes, and we can trace that with the archive between then and now.
Yeah, very much so. So let's move on. So what about the future of aerial survey, what about the future of aerial survey in Scotland? So first of all, with HES, and HES, as we mentioned, we've got our living archive. We're always adding to it, always developing, always growing. And we also have exciting new technologies and aerial data sources that we can make use of, like airborne laser scanning, or LiDAR. It's the same thing. So airborne laser scanning effectively is a method that uses pulses of light sent from an aircraft to measure the ground surface. We get really detailed topographic maps of the ground surface. And in that data, we can see and record, map and record archaeological sites and features, both those that we know of and those that we are previously unknown. It also allows us, in some circumstances, to effectively see below the trees, to take the trees away. And that's what you see in this image here. On the left, circled on the left, we can see the aerial image, which is a kind of Google Earth type image. And we can't see anything on the ground, but using this aerial data, it effectively strips away the trees and gives us a very detailed topographic map. And what it's done here is allowed us to see that beneath those trees is a previously unrecorded Iron Age fort. This is near Newton Stewart. It's so new, it's not in our record yet, or our database yet. And it was recently discovered in airborne laser scanning data. So there's these exciting new discoveries and methods of mapping and seeing and viewing the landscape that we have. An ALS, or LiDAR, allows us to see and study the ground surface of Scotland in a detail that was never possible before. So it doesn't replace the more traditional aerial photography techniques that we've talked about. We'll still go up in a little aircraft and take photographs. It doesn't allow us to record crop marks. We still need that aerial view to do that, or the kind of our more traditional methods of doing that. It doesn't replace surveying the ground, but it's something we can add to our survey methods, and it helps us to do things a bit more efficiently sometimes as well. So for us, that's our future developments, is using this kind of data.
Is there any time scale, Kirsty, on when all of Scotland, I talked about those two All Scotland surveys using standard aircraft camera, moving in a grid up and down the country to take these photographs. Now we have satellite, but this feels like this would be the next step from that 1980s aerial survey, is if we could have this airborne laser scanning of the entire country. Is that on the horizon?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'm not sure how much of the country we've covered. We've got a big coverage of Scotland, so this is funded by the Scottish Government, and we already have a large portion of the country. I would say maybe about 2/3 of the country covered at various degrees of resolution. So for the archaeology purposes, we want the really high resolution stuff. But we've got a lot of this high resolution data covering a large proportion of Scotland, and the aim is to cover the whole of Scotland. So it really is the development of that vertical surveys that you talked about. It's the next step. So we already have a large proportion of the country, maybe 2/3, I'm not sure. So the next 3, 4, 5 years, we would hopefully see that data filtering through to us and have that available for us for research. And
then whose job is it to find things in it? Is that your job? Is that, or is that the computer's job?
Well, it's my team's job, and the computer will hopefully play a part of that in the future. So we've already mentioned briefly, there's a question about artificial intelligence, and that is in it a really key area of research for aerial survey at the moment. So there's a lot of work going on in terms of developing AI methods, artificial intelligence, to scan that data for sites. It's a vast amount of data, so the resources to do that manually is really quite tricky. We have been doing it in some areas, and even that has turned up huge increases in the number of sites. So, for example, we recently finished a survey in Whitadder, which is in the borders. It's the catchment area of the Whitadder Valley, so it's in the borders and it extends into East Lothian. And that was just by a small team. So a couple of people just looking across that data in our team. And we were able to add 1,000 new sites to the record just by doing that manually. Now, if you think about the fact that a human being will miss things, no matter how systematic you think you are, you're not. We will always miss features. If you think about the increasing number of sites, if we could get the artificial intelligence to work really well and it's beginning to work, need just a little bit more research, then think about the number of sites, previously unknown sites we have still to find. There is still so much still to find. And, ALS data itself isn't perfect. It finds a lot of sites. We still find new sites in the ground that isn't visible in the data, so it doesn't do away with the person on the ground or the archaeologist.
Do you have to teach it what archaeology is?
Yes.
That's part of the process. Is what you can't set up a computer program and just say find archaeology. There has to be a process of trying to explain, whether it's logarithmically or to work with an AI to get it to know what to look for, essentially. And that I'm quite fascinated by that process.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that a lot of that research is being done within universities rather than within HES, although we obviously have a very huge interest in it. And it takes quite a lot of technology and skills. So the computer needs to be taught what archaeology looks like. And if you think about the fact that there's so much variability in archaeology, that's a really tricky thing to do. But it is something that is beginning to show results. So we've had some very kind of early results where computers been able to pick up on some archaeology, including archaeology that we've compared it to stuff that we've already looked at that the archaeologists didn't necessarily pick up on. So it has real promise. The trickiest part, yes, is in teaching the computer what archaeology looks like and what isn't archaeology, because you've also got lumps and bumps of geology and geography, and probably what it amounts to in terms of teaching the computer what to look for is we may have to teach it to look for archaeology in specific geographical areas, because your geography and geology is quite different in different areas. So I mean, there's still a lot of research ongoing on that, and there's definitely some still way to go.
But I mean, it's potentially an absolute landslide of sites. Maybe not massive sites, but still sites nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about the fact that we found, it wasn't me, but it was a couple of my colleagues found 1,000 new sites. I think it's a bit more than 1,000 new sites in this relatively small area in Whitadder.
What area are we talking? How big? How many kilometers square, roughly?
I'm not sure. It's something like maybe about 100 kilometers. No, it's more than that. A couple of 100 kilometers across, north to south. So I mean, it's not all of Scotland, but it's a substantial area in itself. We had an earlier survey in the Isle of Arran, so that's much easier to visualise, I suppose. And again, about 1,000 new sites were discovered in Arran. It doubled the sites that we already had in our record. Not all of them are like the really exciting sites, but they're as in the kind of headline type of sites, archaeological sites you might think of.
I hope it's always 1,000 new sites that are found. Is someone just needs to tweak the computer to allow it to find more than 1,000.
1,001 would be fine. Yeah, but the potentials. There's just this amazing potential there. I think once we get the technology working, really has the potential to really change, our perception and change the way in which we work. I think as archaeologists. I mean, as I said, it doesn't do away with us as archaeologists. It doesn't do away with the kind of doing the field survey. Doesn't do away with aerial survey, but it adds to it, and actually it makes our job perhaps different, maybe easier in some ways. Also gives us headaches in terms of adding 1,000 new sites to the record as well.
And I suppose there's almost a level beyond that, which is hyperspectral technology, which is beyond human sight, beyond airborne laser scanning, which is looking for again, interventions, human interventions in the landscape, at another leap beyond where we are now. So there's just an interesting kind of arc in the story of using the view from above that just keeps, as technology develops, it keeps finding new ways of finding new things. Mm-hmm. But the unifying idea is you need to get up there to have landscape context.
You do, totally. That aerial view is important regardless of the technology that you're using. So we have some more questions from Facebook. So we have a question from Ruth who asks, any plans to open to the public to search for sites or objects similar to star mapping opening to hobbyists? Well, we as HES don't at the moment, but there have been some projects who have opened up the ALS data for individuals to look for sites themselves. And I'm thinking specifically of a project that was running in parallel to our project in Whitadder, which was what was it called? It was called the Whitadder. It was a Whitadder project anyway, I think, as well. And there's if you search for Whitadder, you'll see there's an amazing website, and they made available the ALS data for anyone to look over and to identify sites. So there's been some small projects across the country run by councils and other groups as well. So these small projects are available and probably will grow in time as we get more data as well, because again, it's a great way of allowing people to see their own landscape in a way that they're not seen before, and also for people to get involved in looking, and that excitement of discovery of sites in this data as well. So,
I mean, it's interesting when the last series, and you mentioned Scape. We worked with Scape in the last series of in the Sky, looking at the ship's graveyard, which is just a little way down the River Clyde, and there's a whole host of abandoned 19th century, even early 20th century vessels that used to dredge the Clyde to make it wide enough to get and deep enough for the major ships that were being constructed at Clydebank to actually get along the river. And that ship's graveyard was only discovered, I think, in maybe 5 or 6 years ago by someone looking on Google Earth. So archaeologists don't have all the answers, because even Scotland, which is a comparatively small country, is a very big country. there's things everywhere. So that kind of public input is always useful and is always interesting, because people are genuinely discovering things.
Yeah, and really, really important, because as archaeologists, as you said, we don't have the, we certainly don't have the time and the resources to look at all of this data. So to have the public looking and identifying and telling us about this stuff is really important. And actually, the public is likely to see things that we as archaeologists haven't noticed before, because there's just so much still to find, really. So that was HES. So what about the future for yourself, Jamie? Can you tell us anything about the next series of Scotland from the Sky? Have you got anything to tell us about it?
Yes, I can. So we filmed the series over the summer, from May through to August. I think this is the most epic one we've done. We covered an incredible amount of ground. We got out to the Western Isles for the first time, so the very top of the Western Isles to almost the very bottom, to the second last island in the chain of the Outer Hebrides, on Mingulay. So I think more of the same of the sorts of things that people have seen in the previous series, but really, really, I mean, when I've seen the footage, I've just been blown away by how stunning it has been. When we went to Mingulay, there were about 1,000 seals on the beach. And we've got this incredible drone photography of us arriving. I mean, this is a story of abandonment and a community on Mingulay that left at the start of the 20th century. So there's a lot of that, again, a lot of this beautiful drone photography, a lot of me in the helicopter doing match shots again, looking at stories of loss and abandonment, actually looking one whole episode is dedicated to sport, of all things, and how our landscape has shaped the activities, our leisure activities, our sporting activities, and how those sports have shaped our landscape in return, which is something that might not seem like it lends itself well to aerial photography, but actually I think works so beautifully. So I'm really looking forward to people seeing that. So I think, and I heard this earlier on today, that the first program in the series is going to be right at the start of November, 1st of November, Monday night, 9 p.m. That may change, so look at your TV schedules, watch this space, etc. And then it'll be 3 one-hour episodes again. So the 1st, the 8th, and the 15th of November. So hopefully everyone who is watching tonight will watch that when it appears on BBC One Scotland, and then it will be shown again on BBC Two nationwide, although I'm not exactly sure when that will be. But anyone can watch it anywhere on the iPlayer.
That's brilliant. I look forward to that. I'll put that in my calendar, and I'll definitely be watching that when it's on. So that's all that we have time for tonight. Thank you so much, Jamie, for this evening. It's been great to chat to you. If anyone's got any questions that we haven't been able to follow up tonight, we'll follow up in the chat. If you're watching this back at a later date, do leave a comment on Facebook and YouTube, and we'll do our best to get back to you. So thank you again, Jamie, and thank you to all of you at home for joining us. And remember that this will also be available to watch back or to share from on our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. So good night and thank you.
Thank you.